All right, welcome back and home stretch now. Edefe Ojomo joins us now. She's a lecturer in international law, University of Lagos, and we'll be talking about developments in Egypt. Thank you for coming on today.
Thank you.
Well, looking at this, I mean, yes, I did read while I was away. Some talking about when I can't remember his name now. I said it was a people's coup. And then people are asking questions. So what do you mean? A coup is a coup. You've been following development in Egypt. What do you think?
I think right now the anti-Morsi camp is saying this is not a coup. And the reason is simply because it's backed by a majority of the voting populace. And the difference between this and so some people say, well, it's because the military isn't in power, so they're not getting involved in politics, but they're getting civilians involved in politics. So this isn't a coup. But if we remember,
indirectly involved?
So they're managing the process in a sense.
Oh, okay.
So if we remember Togo from a few years ago, it was similar. President Yadema died, and then the military says, his son will become the president in his stead. But the difference between this and that is just the backing by this huge number of people and then the signing of the petition. And they continue to insist that this is not a coup. It's our revolution. It's our movement. It's the people saying we don't want this leadership anymore. And they feel it's insulting to call it a coup.
Is it possible to have an insight into the mindset of the average Egyptian voter?
Yes. So, unfortunately, I don't know very many pro-Morsi people, but I've been able to talk to a few anti-Morsi people. And the sense is these people came into power for the purpose of helping us build a strong Egyptian state, but they're not doing that. So it's about international politics, it's about domestic politics, it's about the domestic economy for the average Egyptian voter. And they feel that this government hasn't been delivering, and this is them saying, we don't want this government anymore. We want a government that will deliver and that will be more inclusive as opposed to...
Would you say that Egyptians have been patient, considering the fact that Morsi was in power for less than a year, about a year, and it was characterized by lots of protests as well?
Exactly. I believe that so if you ask the people at Tahrir what this is about, they would say, well, he's made too many blunders. So there was the Constitutional Declaration, which they thought was, this is the first time anybody's making a declaration like this. The crime rates in Egypt, they say the streets are no longer safe. And for anybody who's been to Egypt, it basically used to be one of the safest places to be. The streets of Egypt were, except if you're a woman. And then there's the economy. So basic commodities become more expensive, which I think is particularly important because of the role that subsidies have played over the past few decades in basically maintaining some sort of calm, no matter how false. There is the situation with Ethiopia, with Hamas. There are all these things that people point out and say this isn't representative of what we want from a government that represents us.
But now that there are reported cases of people dying, it's taking a completely different turn. This is not what people expected. How much more do you see unfolding in this scenario?
So if you ask anti-Morsi protesters about the possibility of a civil war or about the violence, so the two responses are, number one, there are not this many people dying, so people aren't really, and then there is, people don't think this will spiral into a civil war. They think the military is strong enough to maintain some calm and some peace, and they believe that the level of support for this transition is just is significant enough to prevent any kind of civil disturbance that would be...
Tell us about this mindset. How is it that they were able to get that much signatures, 20 million? And whereas it was the pro-Morsi group that won the elections.
Again, the dissatisfaction.
Also, you have some people who initially voted for him and then switched.
So that is this is basically the sentiment on ground, is there's so people who voted for Morsi and decided things just weren't getting better. In fact, they were getting worse, and have basically turned around to say they don't want him anymore. So, so the idea is that there are about 3 million supporters on the pro-Morsi group, and the numbers just keep increasing in the anti-Morsi camp.
The African Union has a zero tolerance for coups, and it's believed that that policy is aimed at making coup makers and autocrats insecure in expectations of support from other rulers around the continent. Now, but weigh that against what you say is the desire of the Egyptian people. How's that going to play out?
As soon as this happened, I thought, okay, I'd like to see and I'd like to hear, what the African Union response would be to this, because the African Union isn't just against coups, but they're against unconstitutional changes of government. And I thought, okay, it would be nice to see how that's interpreted. So, I mean, coups aren't the only unconstitutional changes that you can have. A revolution, where people basically come on the streets and say, we don't want the government anymore, may be interpreted as an unconstitutional change. But if you think that the Constitution gets its backing from the people, then obviously public opinion and public will can't be unconstitutional, can it? I mean, so I thought it would be nice to, see how the African Union, interprets this, but the African Union just sort of,
Do you think this in any way raises the question concerning what is democracy? Is it going to be defined by the people or what?
There was an opinion about 2 days ago by Tony Blair on this same question, and he was basically saying every country gets to choose what democracy means for them. And I think that's basically what the Egyptians are doing now, is saying, you know what, for us, democracy means the people's voice. And the people's voice is basically, being able to sign a petition or being able to come on the streets and say, this is our opinion and this is what we want, and having the government yield to that.
Do you suspect that a third hand in this? I mean, some people have said that this is it's supported in some ways by many other countries, hoping that Morsi will actually be overthrown.
I think there's as much a third hand in this as there was in the January 2012 protests in Nigeria. I mean, it's 20-something million people on the streets. There's only so much that a third hand can't do. So I think it's a little insulting to call a popular uprising, sort of manipulation. I mean, and of course, this is definitely usually a political response, I remember when UNILAG students went on the streets after the renaming of the university, and people said, well, it's just people pushing the students. I mean, just there's human agency, they have an opinion, and they're coming out on the streets. If 20-something million people come out on the streets, it's because they believe that their voices should be heard. So, I mean, I'm not saying there are no third hands and there's nobody who wants this to happen or doesn't want it to happen, but the Egyptian people, they own this, and it's a little bit insulting to ascribe it to somebody else. And it was one of the things that continued to get me is how this has basically been the entire revolution has been called like a military coup. And I think what upsets many of the people at Tahrir is it's not about the military, it's about us. We wanted this, we came out and we said what we wanted. The military is basically a tool for us to achieve this with minimal violence. As opposed to, so my friend Rima I was talking to yesterday, and she says, well, we didn't want to go to the Presidential Guard, we didn't want to go to, to burn down buildings and burn down ministries to prove our point, but here is a somewhat legitimate holder of the instruments of violence. So so they're basically the tool that we're using to make sure that this happens in as peaceful manner.
You were talking about the definition of democracy, and you talked about Tony Blair. So was it Tony Blair?
Tony Blair.
Yeah, his definition about how every country will have to find its own way. Some people have said that there is no way that Africa can practice democracy the way it's practiced in Western liberal countries, because we always need some amount of dictatorship. Do you agree?
Not really. I obviously think that every country, every society needs to define the instruments of governance, define leadership. I think that Africa is still in the process, African countries are still in the process of trying to find our feet, find ourselves in that whole process. That it requires dictatorship. It obviously requires a strong authoritative hand, but that it requires dictatorship,
Wouldn't that be one and the same thing? A strong authoritative hand. What would you mean by that?
I mean that there has to be, in order to build institutions, at the beginning, you need a strong authoritative hand that basically makes people understand that things have to be done a certain way, and if it's not done, then there will be consequences. And eventually values are built and people learn to do things in that way, and people can own the institutions. And one of the things about this that is particularly interesting is how much the Egyptian people understand that they own governance. They own the country, And it's something I think, for example, we haven't owned Nigeria. The closest, again, that we came was last January. But that ownership is important. So that ownership is necessary for institutions, and there's a process that leads to that point.
Should this be, like a warning sign to leaders on the continent and indeed around the world?
So when the Arab Spring began in 2011, I remember a lot of non-African friends, they called and they said, what does this mean for governance south of the Sahara? And I was like, well, nothing, because for many of those countries, you find that something had been taken away. So it was serious economic decline. And people couldn't afford, in Egypt, there were all these subsidies on bread, on oil, on tomatoes, and people couldn't afford these anymore. And life had become hard. But in Africa south of the Sahara, I just thought, what can you take away from us that would spur us into action? And, and I guess for us, it was the fuel subsidies. So that was why so last year, like 1 year after the fuel subsidy protests began, and I thought to myself, okay, so I guess this is what could be taken away from us and spur us into action. Well, perhaps it wasn't strong enough, but it was just being there in January of 2012 and seeing the massive protests and seeing all of these people together in one place with one voice, owning the entire process, gave me some hope that, Nigerians can actually, make demands, and perhaps it would be something that would drive us towards that process of...
Some people have also talked about, comparing a lot of this developing democracies and China, saying that, oftentimes democracy doesn't bring development, and that maybe it's time that people start studying other forms of government if development is what they need at the end of the day.
I think it was Huntington in his Political Order in Changing Societies who said that what doesn't matter is how people are governed, but that they are governed at all. So, again, it's finding some form of governance that people will accept. And we don't even have to go as far as China. Let's go to Saudi, or the UAE, and these are countries that are touted as, really strong economies, developing and all of that, but there isn't any kind of, democratic institution in a sense in many of these countries. And again, I also thought that perhaps that was one of the reasons why many of the protests didn't spread to the Gulf, was because people were a bit too comfortable, so nothing had been, again, we were too weak and too disempowered for anything to be taken away from us. They had too much and nothing had really, the bread hadn't been taken out of their mouth, so...
All right, well, we'll have to let it go there. Edefe Ojomo is a lecturer in International Law, University of Lagos. Thank you for coming.